In this video, I'll explore some relatively new features of CSS animation, including animation timeline and animation range. These properties allow us to enable scroll-based animations, or animations that are tied to our scroll bar position, such that as I move my scroll bar up and down here, or forwards and back, our animations play through their timelines. And you can see that we can trigger different animations as I scroll up and down. So this is what we'll be making here. And this used to only be possible and achievable with some JavaScript, and it was sometimes a little janky, but now we can do this with pure CSS, or at least mostly pure CSS, because as of this recording, these features are fully supported in Chrome and Edge, but they're only kind of flagged and coming to Firefox. And so right now you do need to use a JavaScript polyfill in order to get Firefox support. But anyway, these features allow us to progressively enhance the user experience through some fun, dynamic animations, or they might be a little bit more practical, such as the nav bar that's in here. And you'll notice that that nav bar is sticky, and then as we scroll down, it adds this drop shadow effect so that the content is clearly sort of falling underneath, gives it a little sense of depth. But that drop shadow is tied to the scroll bar position in a way that might enhance the user experience as well. So there can be practical use cases as well as some dynamic kind of fun branding types of use cases for this code. Speaking of code, let's get started with how to code all of this. And I already have a few elements in here. I've populated this with some of the HTML content, and I've got a style sheet started, but I've barely put anything in here as of now. But you'll see that I've got sort of a nav with a navigation menu. I've got a header that includes a sort of feature image inside of it, as well as the words animated header. I've got a section with some paragraphs of content, including a image in the middle of that section. And all of this just sort of scrolls down the page with a couple big images that are in there. Let's go ahead and start adding some of the CSS to make this work better for us, and to, of course, explore scroll-based animations. I'm going to start with the thing at the top of the page, which is the nav, and let's just kind of get this prepared here. And so I'll start by having the background white, a width of 100%, a height of 100 pixels. I'd like to center my items there, and so I'm going to add display of flex, align items of center, justify content of center, so that my navigation would be in the center. And I didn't necessarily want this to scroll with the page. I want it to be sticky, and so I'm going to add the position of sticky for that, and then give it an offset from the top of only 0 pixels, so that my content would scroll under that content. I might want to make sure that it's always on top by setting a z-index that's a very high number, so that it's always on top of other content. And so I'll start with that, with the nav. Let's go ahead and address the header that's here and just get some of the core CSS out of the way. Now, I know that I want my header to be a width of 100%, go across the screen, and actually have a height that mimics the viewport height, so that that header goes there. Now I've got these giant images that are overflowing that content, and so I want to deal with that, and that's going to be referencing the image that's in the header, or the header image here. And so one of the things I can do with that is use the great object fit property, so that that object is covering within here, and I'll tell the image itself to have a width of 100%, and then we can see that that's going to now fit within this environment. I want the image maybe to only have a height of perhaps about 80 viewport units that are there, and what we'll do is we'll position this sort of absolutely as well. So I don't necessarily want to push the header text that was there down. And so we'll take that header text, which is now hiding underneath the nav. We'll have to move that but I'll position this absolutely so that it is being ignored by the H1 in this case, and we'll have to reposition that H1. I do want to have top left, bottom, and right offsets of 0, and I can achieve all of that by just saying inset 0 for that. And so that basically says that we want all the edges to be 0, and we're going to be positioning that across the screen. I also want to make sure that this isn't covering any other content that might be available. So for that, I might make sure that it has a z-index of -1, for example. And so any other content will then go on top of it. So now we can actually see the header that's there sitting right there on top. All right, so let's go ahead and move into the header itself, the H1, I should say. And I'll style that with a little bit of CSS as well. So I'll reference that H1 and let's put some basic CSS on there to have a big font size. I'm centering it on the screen, transforming it uppercase, making the color white. And of course, when the color is white, sometimes you can't see it as well. Adding a little text shadow there will help have that pop out. I would like it a little bit further down on the screen. I might add just a little padding on the top of that and say that I want padding on the top of maybe 5 viewport height units. All right, and so now I want to move on to some of this other content that's down below, some of the section content, get some of the core CSS written for that. So I'll reference that section. And let's add some CSS for some of this stuff that's sitting below here. Because of course we've got our section tag with a couple paragraphs of content under there. And so that's what I want to address. I'm going to start by making the width a little bit smaller and centering this. So width of 60%, margin 0 auto, and we'll achieve that. I can't help but mess with the fonts a little bit. So let's add font size and line height to that so that the fonts are just a little bit bigger. I now have this giant image that's underneath that, so I'd like to address that image. I can reference it with section image, or I could give it a class if I wanted to be specific for that. So I know that maybe I wanted to do something different with different section images. If I gave this a specific class, in this case I called it imager, then we might target that image only in that case, or anything with the imager class that's there. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to say it's section image with the class of imager, and we'll make this responsive by making it display as a block and telling it to have a max width of 100%. So there it's going to be within the frame. Okay, so we've gotten a little of the housekeeping out of the way in terms of some core CSS that I wanted to have on here. And so let's start working with some of the animation stuff that we wanted to enable with scroll-based animation. In this more completed demo, you'll notice that as I scroll down, the image there is getting larger and fading out, and then the scroll-based animations header that's there is also fading out before the new content kind of comes into place. So I want to kind of play with that and make those things fade out before this other sort of content gets in there. And that gets a little weird if my mouse gets off the scroll bar there, but get the idea there. So I'm going to start with those things. Coming back to our content here. What we want to do with this background header image here is do a kind of fade out and scale up animation. So I'm going to do that through at keyframes animation. And so this is adding all of the browser extensions for support, but I just want to say at keyframes. And so I'm just going to name this fade and scale. as my title. And then what I want to do is go from 0%, and I like to use the percentages personally, but to 100%. And what we're going to do is we're going to start this, it starts opaque, right? So the opacity at the beginning here is 1, and the scale is 1. And so we'll start with opacity and scale of 1. And then what we'll do is once we're all the way done here, we'll take the opacity and make it 0, and we'll take the scale and make it maybe twice as big. So we'll have like a scale of 2 that's here. So I'm kind of mixing and matching transform scale and then just scale property. So I'm going to do it like this, where we'll say we're going to make this scale to 2 and have our opacity. So it should fade in and get larger. And of course, this was supposed to start as scale 1 when we start, and then it will go to twice as big as it fades out. So on that header image, what we could do is add in our animation. So I'm going to say animation. We wanted the fade and scale animation. And if we were doing this traditionally, we'd give this like a amount of time. So it takes 3 seconds to fade and scale. And you can see that happening here, where as I have that, 3 seconds. And however we do it, if we wanted a linear animation or an ease animation, we could see that that would fade and scale. And you typically want linear when you're having this timeline based. Now, if we were doing this for a timeline, we wouldn't necessarily have the amount of time. And so we're going to change this instead to just, I'm going to make it 0.1 milliseconds. And I do that because it seems like it helps with some level of browser support to not just have this be auto in terms of the time, but the time won't really matter here, because what we're going to do is we're going to attach this to an animation timeline, and that animation timeline is going to be for scrolling. And so we'll set that to scroll. And when we do this, we can take a look at kind of what happens with that image. I'm going to go ahead and hit save here. And as I scroll down the page now, that image should get bigger and start to fade out. Now the problem, it is getting bigger and it is fading out, except that it doesn't get to 100% until we're down here. So that's not quite working yet. So there's a couple ways that we can make that better. We could say that we want the animation range to be different. So I'm going to say animation range. I could say, hey, we want it to start at 0% at the top of the browser, but maybe be completed by 50% of the way down. If we were doing it that way, you'll see that this is going to be fully faded out once I'm sort of 50% of the way down. Now, even that, like, I kind of want it faded out altogether before this other content comes in. So we could play with these numbers in terms of what that range might be. And really, there's a couple things I could do to make this work better. I could make the animation range shorter, and so that, it's going to fade out a little bit quicker. That would totally work. Or in theory, I could also make my keyframes here, like let's say I had it faded out by 40%. And so, in other words, the animation happens a little faster, and that would make it also animate out a little faster. So there's a couple options in terms of how we could make that tie to the scroll bar and animate away as we want. Now you'll notice that as I'm doing this, the header itself is also sort of moving up and going away. And I kind of like the header to stay there while we're being scrolled. And so what I'll go down to do is take that header and tell it that its position is going to be fixed so that it doesn't move away while we scroll down. Once I do that, I do need to give it a width. I'm going to say 100%. And so that header now, as we scroll, it's not necessarily going away. I do want it to also fade out. So once we're scrolled down a little bit, maybe it fades out as well. But instead of animating away, that stays there. And we're getting this kind of nice scaling effect as I scroll up and down based on our animated timeline here with fade and scale. Let's add an animation to that H1 animated header as well. So again, I'm going to have an at keyframes animation, and I'm going to call that, I'll call it hide me, because what we want to do is hide that animation. And so we'll start with an opacity of 1, and then what we'll do is we'll end this at 100%. I'm going to just copy this over and say at 100% it's going to have an opacity of 0. And so pretty simple, we'll just take that opacity and have that fade out. And then what we can do is we can add that to the header itself. So what we'll want to do is say, hey, we're going to have an animation. The animation is titled Hide Me. And let's say it was 3 seconds, just as an example. In 3 seconds, we wanted it to fade out. We could make that a linear animation, just as an example. And you'll see that we get this sort of animated element where that's fading out in that case. I could make it where it doesn't pop back in once it's faded out. It's not coming back with the animation fill mode of both. So if you don't have that on there and you get the animation, as soon as it's done, it will go back to its original state. But we can add an animation fill mode, forwards, backwards, or both in order to sort of leave it on its end animation state. So I might want to do that. Okay, so this, of course, we wanted to tie to the timeline as well. And so instead of like having some big time, I'm going to go ahead and make that 0.1 milliseconds. And what we'll also do here is, and the truth is I could leave the timeout altogether. It should still work without that. But what we'll do is we'll add an animation timeline. So I'm going to say animation timeline, and we will make that be based on the scroll position. So I'll say animation timeline scroll. And so as we scroll now, that header should start to fade out. And by default here, it's not going to be fully faded out until we're at the very, very bottom of the browser. So that's not exactly what we want, but you can see that that is tying to the 0% of the animation is when the scroll bar is at the very top, 100% of the animation is when the scroll bar is at the very bottom, and we're able to have that animate away in that case. So that's pretty cool that we could tie it to that. But in order to do this more effectively, I'm going to need to add an animation range. And so that would be saying, hey, I actually don't want it from 0% being at the very top. I actually want 100% of my animation to be done by the time the text hits it, which is sort of right here. Maybe that's about 20% of the way down or so. And so the animation range, which I got to spell correctly, would be starting at 0, but like ending by about 20% of the scroll. And so in this case, as I start to scroll down, the animation is going to happen a little bit quicker, and by about 20% of the way down, that header is completely faded out. And that's what I want with this, is to have that header just fade out as I scroll down. When I scroll back, it does come back. But that's the idea here. That header would be there and then just kind of scroll away. So pretty cool that we can tie these to the timelines, make that work effectively. Now, one of the things I have in the demo, and something we might want to add, that if I refresh this page, we also have an animation that happens and plays in that's not tied to the timeline. So as we scroll down, that goes away, but the animation that starts at the very beginning here of it sort of moving into position is not tied to the main timeline. And so let's say we wanted to enable that within our document. We want to have a second animation basically on that H1. We could do that. And so again, I'll have another at keyframes, and we'll define that separately. And so let's say I just called that get big, in other words, scale up. And what we might do is just adjust the font size, for example. So at 0%, what we'll do is have the font size be small, maybe 12 pixels. And then we could take that font size from 0% to 100%. And so I'm going to go ahead and say we want it 100%. And at 100%, it's going to be the size that we defined it, which is 96 pixels in size. And I could use viewport units for these if I wanted it to be a little bit more tied to the screen size. But there we go. We're going to have that get big to go up there. And so instead of, I don't want this one tied to the main timeline though. So I don't want this tied to the scroll. I want that independent. And so to do that, what I could do is actually just stack my animation and have two options. And so we'll separate those with a, let's say it takes 2 seconds there and it eases, and sort of adds, animation fill mode would be on both. What I'll do is I'll have a comma there to separate these out. And then what I'll need to do is have comma-based stuff on this as well. So I'm going to have this be auto for the animation timeline, and then the second one be based on scroll. And that means that this first one is not based on scroll. So that will still have that one fade out, but if we get a refresh here, and it would start that animated header right there. So as we go, we'll refresh that out, get this animated header. That's awesome. And we can have two animations there, one tied to the timeline, one not tied to the timeline, but on the same element. All right, so let's quickly explore a couple other things. I did want that navigation menu that once I scroll down here to have a bit of a drop shadow to it. So I might not want that drop shadow at first when maybe I don't need it yet, right? But as I'm getting content rolling underneath it, maybe I'd like to kind of see where that edge is by a little bit of drop shadow. And so we can tie that to the timeline, of course, with some of our animation. And so what I'm going to do here is find that section, where is it, with the nav, and I'll add in that keyframes right above that I'm going to use. So I'll say add keyframes, and we'll create one. I'm going to call it Shadow Me. And so it's going to add a text shadow, or box shadow, I should say. Really not, I don't want it on the text, I want it on the box. And so we can do that. And I really don't necessarily need to define both the beginning and ending. I could just define the two part of this. If it starts normally, and you just are going to a particular direction, that might work. And so I'm going to do that. I could say that I want this to start as a, and I'm going to add in a, just start as it would normally, but then it's going to move towards having a box shadow. And I want that box shadow to be, let's say, 0 pixels, but a little bit on the bottom, a little bit of blur, and we could have it with RGBA so that it's not quite so, when you just use black as the color, it gets a little too dark, so I want a little bit of transparency on that. Maybe I'll say 0.3 for the alpha on there. So that might be cool. And another thing I might add to this is maybe change the height overall. I'm going to change it to like 50 pixels and so that the header itself gets a little bit smaller, more narrow as we move down to it. So I'm just going to have those be the options. And then on the nav itself, what we can do is add our animation. So this is going to be the Shadow Me animation. So I need to type that and match it with what I had called it. And then I'm going to make that linear. I want that animation to stick there once I'm done with it. I could say that I want it to be both or whatever, or just forwards perhaps as far as it goes. You'll see that it's sort of snapping to the smaller version with the shadow. But what we'll do is we'll tie this to the to the animation timeline of scroll, and what we might need to do is add a range for it, because as we go down, that's going to go very, very slowly, where it's adding that shadow and getting smaller. But I actually really wanted it in place by the time the text hits it right here. I want it sort of fully in place and smaller by then. And so that looks like it's maybe 25% of the way down the page or so. And I might not even want it to start immediately. So if I don't want it to start immediately, I could say that the animation range, like, it doesn't begin until you've begun scrolling about 10% of the way down the page, but it completes itself by the time you're 25% of the way down the page. And so with that, it's not going to start until about 10% of the way down, and then it's going to slowly add that shadow and get smaller until I'm like 25% of the way down of my scroll. So that actually seems to not be fully complete by a little bit further to the end here. Oh, I didn't say animation range. There we go, animation range, not just animation range, so that as I scroll down, it should be fully complete. There it is by about 25%. So you see nothing for the first 10%, and then it goes away and becomes fully complete by this last part. I actually think I might make that even further down, 25% or so, and or 15%. So for 15% of the scroll, it does nothing, and then it's going to make it shift as we scroll down the page. So just an example that might be a useful kind of use case for that, where you might do something with that sticky header to give it a little bit of shadow as content is actually going to fall kind of more underneath it like that. So bit of an idea. And then one of the last ones I'll explore is animating this image. So maybe when I come into view, and we'll do this just a little bit differently, where I don't necessarily want that completely tied to the scroll bar overall. I only want to have it animate while I'm seeing it on the screen. And so instead of the animation timeline of scroll, we have an option called animation timeline of view. And that just means basically while it's in view. So the scroll bar position is, it's really 0% is when it's coming into the screen, and 100% is when it's finally leaving the screen. And so with that, we could only do the animation while we're kind of while it's in the viewport window, basically. So let's do that. That's the header image. No, that is the section image that's there. And let's say what we did is a kind of revealing animation on there as we're going down the page. So I'm going to have an at keyframes definition that I'm going to call reveal. And what we'll do is we'll go from 0%, we'll have this have an opacity of 0, let's say, and then at 100%, we'll have that opacity be we'll have that be at 1. So with that, I could add my animation to this. And so what I want is it to have the animation of reveal. And it's going to be linear, go both directions in terms of the animation fill mode. And then I want my animation timeline here tied to the scrolling. So this is the animation timeline. And so typically what we've been adding here is scroll. And if we do that, then you'll see that this is going to be like when it's in view, it's actually fully faded out up here and fully revealed down here. But in the middle, we get like this partial transparency. And so it's really not what we wanted. We actually want to sort of fade in while it's in view. And so instead of that, what we could do is use the property called view. And that means that it will be fully faded out when it starts and fully faded in by the time we're at the bottom here and is leaving the timeline. Now I could readjust that animation range so that it is happening just a little bit more quickly. And the animation range, when it comes to viewing, you do have some different options related to as it's entering, what's called entry and exit, and some of the percentages that work with that, or you can use these properties called cover, or the property values called cover. It's always useful to turn to some references with these things, and certainly the Mozilla documentations at the MDN are really useful. So animation range is shorthand for animation range start and animation range end, and a lot of the different properties for animation range, it shows you how you might set these. And so you'll notice that there's an entry exit as well as this thing called cover, and you can learn a little bit about what that means. And you can see that cover means the point by which the element that we're animating here first start to enter the scroll port's view progress visibility range to the point where it has completely left that visibility range. So as it enters and finally exits, it's a little different than the entry exit ones, but I'm going to pop back to my code and we'll add in this sort of range idea. So what I'm going to add to this is an animation range, and we'll say we'll use cover, and I want it to start sort of about 25% of the way in, and then 40% of the way out we're going to be done. And so you'll see what that sort of means is that it doesn't start at all until I'm about 25% of the way in, and then it's going to begin, but it's going to be done by the time it's about 40%, and it will be fully opaque at that point. So it sort of pops in here as we get into it a little bit. So kind of like that better as a range. It's more in the viewport, and we're still tied to the timeline, but we're getting that animation right there. Now that reveal that we're doing, I think it could be made better by having a clipping path to this. And so what we'll do is we'll sort of inset this with a clip path, and you'll see what I mean by that. I'm going to add a sort of clipping path to the image itself that will be inset. And what I wanted to do really is take it in from all sides. So I'm going to be insetting it all the way around the top, right, bottom, and left by 50%. That means it's really completely hidden if we're insetting it 50% on all sides. But what we'll do is we'll take that clip path and have it go towards having really no inset. So I'm going to say an inset of 0% on all of those sides. And so once we get this dialed in, you'll see what this will look like. Basically what that's going to mean is as I'm coming down here, if we get this correct, and I made a mistake and separated these by commas, which they don't have commas. You'll see that what's going to happen with this is as we're scaling up, it's going to have a sort of inset, which is pushing in on that particular element. And then we're going to get this kind of reveal that's happening on it so that we get this scale reveal, which is kind of neat as we scroll up and down. So sort of a more fun feature here. Not only is it sort of fading in, but it's also scaling in. And instead of just scale, it's sort of clipping the sides to get that sort of mask look and reveal as we go up and down. So there's a few of the things that we might be able to do with scroll-based animations here. So certainly you can have traditional animation that happens in addition to doing a scroll-based animation on the same element, but kind of some fun elements I think that might add some dynamic qualities, progressive enhancements, and maybe some practical use cases to your web designs through animation timelines and scroll-based animations. Before I go, I did want to mention a couple useful resources for scroll-driven or scroll-based animations, including this site at scroll-driven-animations.style, where you'll find some really cool demos and tools related to scroll-based animations. One of the things they mention is that Firefox, which I'm using right now, doesn't necessarily support scroll-based animations, and so you'll have to enable that support through a polyfill, and that polyfill is over here at GitHub. You can take a look at the URL address for that. One of the ways that you can integrate that polyfill is simply by adding this script. Now you might want to download the script, but I could copy that, return back to my content here, my web page, and simply include that script at the very, very bottom of my code. Before the closing of the body tag, I could add this reference to the GitHub scroll-based timeline or scroll timeline JS that's there. By adding that JS, I've just enabled some Firefox support for this content. And so this demo that I have over here, for example, is indeed in Firefox, and all of the elements that I had done in the demo do work here in Firefox, but they don't work unless they're enabled by that polyfill. So you will want to add that polyfill to your page to get full support, at least until Firefox gets updated. I know that this feature is coming to Firefox, and so we should be able to have this available to us in the future across all modern browsers. But for right now, the support, because it's a newer feature, is a little bit more limited. And so you might need to add that polyfill. One last tour through the code before I leave here. Some of the HTML that I was using and some of the CSS. I'm just going to scroll through in case there was something that you missed or got wrong and wanted to kind of update on your own. Little final code tour through there. Hopefully your experience with scroll-based animations here, both either for tied to the scroll or tied to scrolling while in view, has been enlightening and fun for you. Until next time.